Sorry. We've got quite a lot of post-ex still to be carried out, so we're missing quite a lot of dating and specialist evidence. So what I'm going to do is actually take you through all the work that's been done at Dinas Dinlle, but focusing on our excavations, which we carried out earlier in last year it is now. So for anybody who's not familiar with the site, Dinas Dinlle is on the coast to the southwest of Carnarvon, as we can see on this Google Earth picture. It's a Iron Age and stroke Romano British hill fort with originally about 4 hectares. We use the word hill fort. It's a bit of a catch-all phrase. Some people agree with it as a sensible way of describing this kind of monument. We could look at it as a defensive site. We could look at it as a focus of a territory. We could look at it as a ritual site. I think probably the most sensible way of looking at this kind of thing is a site with multiple functions that probably changed over the hundreds of years that it was used. It's an Iron Age. We believe it has Iron Age origins. So we're looking at the first few hundred years BC, and it was continued in use through the Roman period, or was reused indeed during the Roman period, as we found mid-3rd century finds eroding out of the cliff at various times. To go back to the very basics, the hill at Dinas Dinlle is a glacial thrust moraine. It's a pile of rocks, gravel, clay, and other stuff deposited as glaciers melted. In this case, the deposits were then pushed and deformed by another glacier during the re-advance of the Welsh ice caps. And we're looking at the formation somewhere around 12,000 years ago. If you walk along the beach, you can see the eroding cliff, and you can see that you can see banding of clay and rocks and stones and gravel and silt that's been sort of broken up, and this is a triple SI, and seemed to be a very good example of this kind of feature. A bit of other history. Dinas Dinlle was for a short while a golf course. This is a plan that was put together by Cherish, and this was the layout of the golf course in the early 1900s. I think it survived until about 1920s. I'm not sure it was a great success, but it was the beginning of the Carnarvon Golf Club. The present project was carried out. We carried out actual work at 2 important sites in the mythical landscape of Llyn and the Nantlle Valley, and the coast along this area. Dinas Dinlle is named and features in the 4th branch of the Mabinogi. The 4 branches are tales that were written in Middle Welsh somewhere around the 11th century, and they're rooted in oral tradition and contain complex tales of friendship, marriage, and feuds in a mythological landscape. The name Dinas Dinlle is often seen as being named after a character in the tales called Lle Llaw Gyffes, Din meaning fort and Lle being short for Lle. It is probable that the tales were mapped onto existing named locations. In the 4th branch of the Mabinogi, I'm not going to go through the whole story because it's very long and complicated. Gwydion tricked Arianrhod, who was Lle's mother, into giving Lle his name, and the translation is that they then went towards Dinas Dinlle, and there he brought up Lle Llaw Gyffes until he could manage any horse, and he was perfect in features and strength and stature, and that's where Dinas Dinlle is mentioned in the Mabinogi. Other features are dotted along the coast here. To the south is the coastal reef of Caer Arianrhod, which is reputed to be Arianrhod's castle or palace, possibly reflecting many decades and hundreds and millennia even of coastal erosion along this part of the coast. The second site that we looked at, which I'm not really going to talk about, was Cricodenas, a promontory fort in a meander of the Afon Llyfni, about 1.8 meters from the coast and not very far from Dinas Dinlle. This is one of the suggested locations for Cloddiadau home and one of the most regularly mentioned place names in the fourth branch. The name no longer exists in the landscape, but this is one of the suggested locations. We put in a few trial trenches there, but found absolutely nothing of interest. So I'm not going to talk about that because we've got more than enough to get through in this looking at Dinas Dinlle itself. There's been a range of archaeological work previously done at Dinas Dinlle. Up until the last few years, there's been no previous official excavation. The site was planned by many people, including the Royal Commission and the Ordnance Survey. One of the last plans was done by the Muckle Partnership for the National Trust. I did a geophysical survey there in 2005. The current work was initiated by the CHERISH project, CHERISH standing for Climate Heritage and Environments of Reefs, Islands and Headlands. As you can see on the screen here, it's a 6-year European funded island Wales project bringing together 4 partners across 2 nations, the Royal Commission on the Ancient Historic Monuments of Wales, Discovery Programme, Centre for Archaeology and Innovation Ireland, Aberystwyth University, and Geological Survey Ireland. The project began in 2017 and will run until June 2023. As part of this project, there's been quite a lot of work done. Principally, we did a second geophysical survey in 2017 and 18. We'll look at that in a minute. The Royal Commission did new topographic, laser and photogrammetric surveys of the site, particularly focusing on erosion. There was an evaluation excavation in 2019 run by CHERISH and the Gwynedd Archaeological Trust, which I'll talk about briefly. And there was a ground penetrating radar survey carried out in 2019. What I'm going to focus on mostly this evening is Gwynedd Archaeological Trust's community excavation, which was carried out over 5 weeks in August and September of 2021. This is the Muckle Partnership plan of the site. It gives us a chance to have a look at the principal features of the site. We've got 2 ramparts on the top of the hill, one on top of the hill, one a bit further down with a deep ditch in between them. A very noticeable entrance in the southeast, almost corner of the fort. There's quite a large and prominent mound within the fort that nobody really knows what it is. It's been suggested that it's a Bronze Age burial mound or a Roman lookout, but nobody really knows what it is. And we've done several different non-intrusive investigations and are still none the wiser. There are some earthworks around the eastern rampart, which could be roundhouses or could equally be golf tees or golf bunkers. We don't really know. One thing that's very obvious from this is that there's been a fair chunk of the fort has been lost to erosion. This is from the Royal Commission's study of the erosion that's been going on. We can see that from map evidence, between 20 and 40 meters have been lost since 1900. We seem to have episodic erosion with occasional big collapses and then nothing happening for a while, but it still comes to between 0.1 and 0.8 meters loss per year. It's not all caused by the sea. In fact, quite a lot of it is caused by runoff of rain from the site, either running down the cliff or coming out of the cliff as it's soaked into the ground. This seems to be one of the major drivers of the erosion. We don't really know exactly how far away from the coast it was when it was occupied, but we can be pretty sure that the defences ran all the way around the hill fort, and it was not too far from the sea. The only other evidence we've got is intertidal peat deposits that are about 100 meters offshore, and they were dated to the Bronze Age, about 4,000 years before present. The reason I've called this lecture the reason we're looking at this is one way of actually preserving a site is by record. It's not real preservation of the site, but we're preserving the information contained in the site by excavation, because it appears there is little chance of saving the site. There's been proposals for coastal defences and all kinds of things, but nothing appears. There doesn't appear to be anything that can actually work and will have a practical positive effect on the site. So we're looking at working on the site, recording it as well as we can as it disappears, and preservation by record is the way we should perhaps look at this. The Cherish team have been looking at the erosion on the site. Here's Patrick and Louise looking at eroding features on the cliff edge. This is quite interesting. It gives you a perspective on where the archaeology is on Dinas Dinlle. The majority of the site, the majority of the mound is glacial deposits, and just this little bit at the top that they're looking at here, this metre or so, metre and a half at the top, is where the archaeology is, buried underneath a certain amount of sand, which we'll come to later on. The Cherish team looked at a few features in the cliff, one of which was the ditch between the two ramparts of the fort. And they found that this appeared to have originated as a natural glacial meltwater channel that seems to have been adopted by the fort builders. So the way the fort was made, it appears that the makers modified the existing features in the hill as much as possible. Well, you would, it'd be the easiest thing to do, and produce the two ramparts by digging out, to some extent, a new ditch along an existing meltwater channel, and by digging possibly elsewhere on the hill. The whole hill is made of gravel and stones. We're not actually encountering bedrock anywhere at all. Let's have a quick look at our previous geophysical surveys. This was the Fluxgate Radiometer survey that John Berman and myself carried out in 2017 and 18. Showed up lots and lots of features, and we surveyed the fort. It's as much of the ramparts as we could get to, and the field to the south. The field to the south, I'll come back to this in a second. The field to the south included a now lost settlement or small hamlet of Penllech. It is now a completely featureless field, but it showed up quite nicely on the geophysical survey. And if we look at the fort itself, there's a lot going on in there. I can pick out probably 10 or a dozen features here that I think might well be roundhouses. We can see the ramparts quite clearly. This was there was a second geophysical survey, which I'm going to take you through in a bit of detail, particularly if you haven't seen one of these things before. I think it's a big step forward in geophysical surveys. This was a ground penetrating radar survey carried out for Cherish by Sumo Survey. What this produces is a series of time slices. So this is ground penetrating radar, and you can see the remains at different depths. So it goes down 0.1 meters at a time. So you can see it's as if you're sinking into the site. So I'm going to quickly flick through their many time slices. So we're starting at the surface here, so there's not an awful lot to see, but as soon as you start sinking down, you start seeing the current pathways, but not a huge amount to see. But as you slowly move down, not far below the surface, suddenly a lot of features start popping up, particularly on the eastern side of the fort, where we think there's less overburden. And as we sink down, things start showing up really clearly. So you can see lots of roundhouses in the center of the fort. Not quite sure what's going on towards the eastern side. And as we sink down further, below the greater depth of substrate on the overburden on the west, we start seeing some quite clear roundhouses showing up along the cliff edge and a bit further into the fort. We can see one particularly large one about halfway along the cliff edge, and possibly hints of further roundhouses below that. And as we sink down, we finally find ourselves in the glacial substrate and the features fade away. So if we compare our different types of survey, we can see that we actually came up with very similar results with the Radiometer survey and the ground penetrating radar, and we could see one particularly clear roundhouse about halfway along the cliff edge, and some other features to the south of that. So the first excavation run by Cherish and supervised by Gwynedd Archaeological Trust opened up two trial trenches across these features. Trench 1 looked at the roundhouse, and trench 2 looked at what we thought might be another pair of roundhouses. I'm not going to go into these in detail because we opened up most of these areas again last year. So just a quick reminder of, if you haven't seen them before, this was the trench that went across the roundhouse. We got two very substantial walls, and we did a certain amount of probing and showed that we got a roundhouse. And we can see that we've got some very substantial walls here, standing almost up to a metre high, made out of very large stones. We'll come back to that in a bit. And the other trench, it was a bit harder to understand. There was a large stony bank that was ran across the trench, and there was and we came down to this rather featureless surface of a buried soil. We couldn't actually identify any features in it. We did find a few pieces of very abraded Roman pottery in it, but once we started we put a couple of small sondages into it, and it seemed fairly clear that the actual archaeology was beneath that. The other thing we've got here is a great deal of sand, but I'll come to that in a moment. This is actually quite significant because when we opened up this area again, we machined at least some of this layer of featureless sort of post-occupation soil off to save time. So that brings us to our excavations last year. This was grant aided by CADU. The site is owned by the National Trust, and they also provided some financial aid, as did the Llyn area of outstanding natural beauty, and Cherish are giving us a hand with some of the post-excavation work. We also were in a partnership with Bangor University, and we were running this as something of a training dig for the students, with some supervisors from the university helping out with the excavation and the supervision there. So this is our two areas of excavation. The first, trench 1 to the north, is aimed to look at all of the roundhouse. Our initial plans were to try and fully excavate the roundhouse, but we'll see how we got on with that a bit later on. The second area of excavation, which we ran principally as a training excavation for the students from Bangor University, had contained quite a lot of archaeology. We're looking at the things that we saw in the 2019 excavations there. So this is an aerial view, I think taken by Toby Driver, of the excavations fairly early on, but it gives you an idea of their position and their sort of how perilously close they are to the collapsing cliff. You can see towards the south of the cliff, south end of the cliff, there's been a fairly serious amount of slumping there, and I think some of that may have actually collapsed subsequently. And the edge of the roundhouse is very close to the edge, to the beginning of the areas of slumping of the cliff there. So that sort of brings it home to the level of threat that we're looking at to the archaeology here. So we'll start with trench 1. This was the Roundhouse. We knew roughly what we were looking for here. This trench was supervised by Neil McGuinness, who sent me some quite a lot of information. So thanks to Neil for getting that sorted out for me, because he's currently in Birkenhead, I think. So this is a very early shot of the site, and we're still removing the sand using a mechanical excavator. There are tons and tons of sand over the top. There is tons and tons of sand over the top of the archaeology here. It appears to have appeared, it seems to have arrived as at a single point in time, or begun to arrive at a single point in time. There's about 1 meter of sand over the top of this side of the site. And we know there were some serious documented inundations, particularly one at Newborough on Anglesey, where we know there was a large amount of agricultural land and some buildings lost to sand inundation on the 6th of December of 1331. And there are records of quite a few other inundations around that same time. So I think it's very likely that this is when the sand started arriving at Dinas Dinlle as well. So what we did was very, very carefully remove the sand overburden from the site, which is without touching as much as possible the Roundhouse walls. And you can see Neil working in the background there, and our first clearing up going on in the foreground. We can already see the top of the wall quite clearly. That wasn't actually not very far below the surface, but there's a large amount of sand to remove from that by hand. So it doesn't actually, when we did have a lot of volunteers on site, I think we had over 20 volunteers on site every day. So it didn't actually take long to begin to see the stones of the Roundhouse, as you can see here. This is a fairly early shot of the Roundhouse after probably 2 or 3 days clearance. You can see its outline, but it's not actually very clear at this point. So the first thing to do really was to remove some of the tumble and the sand from around the walls of the Roundhouse, so we could actually see in a bit more detail what was going on. Already at this point in the material between the tumbled stones, we were beginning to get finds. I think this was the first find from the site, a small piece of black burnished ware pottery from Dorset with a rivet in it, showing that it had been repaired. Before very long, we ended up with quite a clean view of our Roundhouse. As you can see here, this is a bit further on. So I just brought this slide in just to show you what our excavation strategy was. We decided that initially we would try and excavate 2 quadrants of the Roundhouse and to some extent the external areas beyond that, which will give us sections through the deposits in the interior and also a manageable amount of work to do. This is a plan of the Roundhouse, so you can get an idea of its dimensions and structures and whatnot. It has an external diameter of 13.6 meters, which makes it a large but not terribly unusual diameter. It has an internal diameter of 8.6 meters, which brings it closer to an average sized Roundhouse as far as the internal space is concerned. But it has massively thick walls, about 2.7 meters thick, and when they were standing about 0.9 meters high. The outer face is made from large boulders. Well, both faces are made from large boulders with an infill of lots more stones. it's a bit of a curious construction. It's not quite so obvious on here, but we can perhaps see it on some of the photographs. The outer face appears to actually been built as a series of almost straight lines, as opposed to a perfectly circular. The inside is more circular. There's a fairly clear entrance, well, very clear entrance once we started working on it on the eastern side. This appears to have been some loss on the western side. It's quite a bit lower there, but we've still got the facing continuing probably all the way around. It was certainly showed up well in the north west quadrant where we did the excavation. I'm going to have a look at some of the sections that have been drawn after the excavation, and they give us an idea of what's going on here. So the first section I want to look at is this one here. This is in the southeast quadrant. So this runs from outside the roundhouse on the left of the screen, across the roundhouse wall, and then looks at the deposits on the interior of the roundhouse. If I zoom in here, I'll have a quick look at the outside first. We got a series of deposits here, and we also had a rather peculiar linear wall running along, running sort of almost parallel, if you can be parallel to a circular wall, to the roundhouse wall. We picked this up in the trial trench in 2019. I'm not really sure what it is. It doesn't seem to carry on for a great deal of distance, but probably if we excavated further to the south, we might find that it belongs to another feature and it will become more understandable. What we did find was a pebble surface just sort of lapping up to the roundhouse wall, which was set on a series of stones, and then there was a cut beneath that predated both the linear wall and the roundhouse. I'll show you some photos of what we're looking at here. Now, this is our linear wall. It isn't actually really parallel to the roundhouse wall, is it? But and you can see bits of terram from our previous excavation there. We thought it might actually turn into a larger structure, but we didn't actually find out a lot more about it during this excavation. What we could see was that we've got this sort of this gravel surface butting up against the roundhouse wall, sitting on a series of sort of cobbly stones. We think we might be looking at some sort of eaves drip feature here. We carried on looking at this area and made it into a sondage look at the deposits here, and found that there was actually quite a deep, it looks like a linear feature that runs definitely underneath the both walls, but it wasn't picked up in the interior of the roundhouse. So from this small sample of it, it's not entirely clear what's going on here, but it does rather suggest that we have features that predate the roundhouse in this area. Looking at the interior of the roundhouse, this gives us a section through the various levels that we saw within the roundhouse. Practically all of the site from one end to the other in both trenches was covered by a buried soil, a pretty featureless dark brown buried soil containing some Roman pottery, all very small pieces and very abraded. So I think we're looking at a post-abandonment buried soil that built up probably after the whole site was abandoned, I'm guessing, but we can't be entirely sure of that. It could be an agricultural soil of some sort, and that was sitting directly beneath the sand. Now, this does actually give us an idea of what the site looked like, perhaps in the Middle Ages. If we're looking at sand inundation there, sand wasn't really encountered anywhere else apart from one small area on the site. below this level. So I think when this post-abandonment buried soil was actually on the surface, the site would have looked very different. It would have looked very stony. You would be able to see the remains of structures on the site, and this perhaps might explain one of the reasons why it made its way so prominently into legend. It might have looked quite impressive, and if we could, we would have actually been able to see this large and substantial roundhouse on the surface. And we probably would have been able to see quite a number of other structures within the fort. So it wouldn't have been anything like the rather featureless, blank, rounded interior that we see at present. So beneath the post-abandonment buried soil, we came down to another layer that would appear to be some kind of occupation layer, though it was only hints of features that we could actually see in this layer. You could see that there was a sort of clay built up against, and some stones also shoved under the base of the wall and built up against the base of the wall, perhaps to stop water from coming into the building. And that was definitely at the same level as this layer. That appeared to be quite a well-defined feature against the wall, but the layer across the rest of the roundhouse, it was actually quite difficult to see any features in it at all. Now, below that was a thin occupation layer, which contained Roman pottery, and at this point we were beginning to see features appearing within the interior of the roundhouse. So let's have a look at some of that. This is a shot after, I think we've just removed this post-abandonment soil, and as we move slowly down through the deposits, we're beginning to see that we've still got tumble within the soil at some depth. So as we move down into it, actually this is after the lower floor level has actually been mostly removed. This is the clay and stones around the edge of the roundhouse, which makes me think that that really was one of the floor levels, possibly an upper floor level, and there was it looks like there was another one below it, but we're beginning to see features cut into that, so we can see these features here and a few stake holes. Finds were coming out of the floor levels, so we're looking at Romano British finds. This was a particularly startling one. This is a large piece of a Roman mortarium, again with a rivet, a mending rivet in it. This is a kind of quite large vessel. This is quite a bowl-shaped one, a bit more bowl-shaped than normal, which is the interior is covered in grit, and this was used for preparing food. It's kind of a bit like a mortar and pestle kind of thing, and this is quite a large chunk of one that came out of the one of the occupation levels. Unfortunately, we didn't really have time to do an awful lot of excavation of the features once we actually got down to the very bottom of the sequence within the roundhouse. At this point, we're pretty much sitting on natural glacial substrate with features cut into it. We were hoping to find a nice selection of post holes which we could resolve into the timbers supporting the roundhouse roof, but it didn't really turn out quite like that, but it definitely needs further excavation. What we ended up with was a certain amount were pits and a few stake holes. Just have a look at it on the plan here. This is the area that we've just been looking at. So we've got this moderately steep-sided pit that may or may not, could be some kind of a shallow post hole, but it doesn't particularly look like it. But we didn't have time to look at any other features in this area. I'm just going to have a look at this other section in the in this quadrant. This one actually runs right through the entrance, and you can see in the section and indeed on the plan that what we found was there was actually a floor in the entrance made of slate slabs. It was pretty uneven and knocked around, but it was definitely there. Just zoom in a bit, and the entrance had been either deliberately filled with slightly smaller stones, or was just filled with tumble from the walls. It's a bit difficult to tell, but you can see half of the entrance here. So this is these orthostats on the right side of the screen are the mark the edge of the entrance wall, and you can just about see the other side on the other side of the screen. So it's a good 2 meters wide, and you can see the remains of these slate slabs, which appear to have made at least one part of the floor at one level. It looks like it might have had a step in it at this point, but it was all pretty disturbed. We have a look in the northwest quadrant. This actually contained an awful lot more tumble than the other one, and which seemed to actually extend down into our potentially disturbed upper occupation layer. To the outside of the roundhouse, we found 2 buried soil horizons sitting on top of the natural, both pretty featureless, one possibly predating the roundhouse wall, but we couldn't really excavate too much underneath a large and rather precarious stone on the outside of the wall there to be completely certain. We found the same thin floor occupation layer beneath the upper occupation layer. Zoom in here, you can see it a little more clearly. Slightly less clear what was going on here. This was after the removal of quite a lot of the rubble, but just beginning to hit that upper occupation layer. And you can see in the middle that set actually on the lower occupation layer is a quernstone. I think the upper half of a rotary quern, which is actually broken into 1 or 2 pieces, but still all in one, there. So this is quite a large rotary quern that was used for grinding grain at some point, but we quite often find them in buildings reused as working surfaces and whatnot. So it's quite possible that's what this was actually doing in this position. There it is in all its glory. One of the reasons why we think this was a disturbed floor layer is we found within this quadrant a couple of really solid chunks of clay, basically, that was very different to the rest of that layer. They're at the same level, but they look like a proper consolidated floor layer, but it looks like the rest of it has been quite badly disturbed. We never quite know what happens to buildings after they've been abandoned. If you use it as a pig shelter or a sheep or a cattle shelter, it's quite possible that the surface gets quite mixed up and disturbed post-abandonment. So I'm wondering if something like that's happened here. So then we're only actually seeing a few fragments of the upper floor. Taking the tumble and that rather uniform upper floor deposit away, we started to actually see some features within this side of the roundhouse. This is as far as our excavation got. We had 5 weeks to do the excavation, and when we got to that point, we had to stop. This is as far as we got. These all appear to be rather, well, these 2 in the foreground appear to be pit-like features. This was the one in the background was interpreted as a post hole, and in the upper fills of the post hole we found this small turquoise coloured faience bead. So this is made from glass paste, fairly typical Iron Age Romano British find. Quite a nice find from the Roundhouse. And that is as far as we got with this particular Roundhouse. It's a very unusual Roundhouse with these very substantial walls. It doesn't seem to be a huge amount of activity that we could see in the interior. It definitely requires further excavation, which hopefully will happen later on this year, but I'll talk about that in a short while. I'm just going to move on quickly to Trench 2 because I don't want to keep us here all night. Trench 2 was contained another roundhouse, a metal surface, and occupation activity. So I'm going to take you through that now. Again, we were buried. This was all buried under a considerable amount of sand. Here's Neil supervising the excavator. This is probably the most nerve-wracking part of the whole excavation, making sure you come down to exactly the right level. If you don't take enough off, you're going to spend weeks shoveling sand. If you take too much off, you start to damage the archaeology. What we did do is take off a skim of that of the buried soil that we could see across the whole site, because it appeared to be very featureless, and we were not seeing any signs of any activity in that. So after the sand was removed, this is pretty much what it looked like, a bit of a mess, but it doesn't actually take too long, with plenty of mostly students working on the site to actually uncover the top of the archaeology. As I said, this was principally run as a training dig for the students. So we did a lot of teaching of how to draw things, how to fill in context forms, how to take photographs, how to excavate features. There were quite a number of people working on here who hadn't done any archaeology before. So it was a little slow, but we did get, I think, people that learnt quite a lot, and we did get some quite good results from this area. So this is the trench with the north at the top, actually taken from a 3D model made from large amounts of photographs all stitched together in the computer, which produces a nice 3D model, and also gives us a chance to make plans that don't have any parallax errors in them, so we can actually draw up more detailed drawings of stone spreads and such like from this, instead of planning them all on the ground when we're very short of time. So I'll just go back to this and go through the outline of what we found. At the north, we have another roundhouse. We didn't actually find this in the previous year's excavation. It turned out if we dug down about another 2 centimeters, we would have found it, but we didn't. It shows that it was actually quite a good idea to take off some of this rather uniform post-excavation deposit at the beginning of this excavation. On one side of the trench here, on the west side of the trench, there was an early sand deposit, which is the only place we've seen anything like this on the site, which was sitting directly on top of the glacial substrate. As we move across to the east of the trench, in fact, we came across quite a substantial metalled surface. I think calling it cobbled would probably be a bit of an exaggeration, but it was made up of quite tightly packed small stones and gravel. It was definitely a metalled surface. And then to the south, we've got a bank of stone with one or two features on it, and then a large area of heat-affected ground. So I'm going to look at each of these features in a little bit more detail. This was our cobbled surface, which you can see runs all the way up to the bank, and we'll have a look at that in a second. So what we did was extended a previous sondage from the 2019 excavation to take a section right through the bank, which provided lots of entertaining section drawing practice for the students, and gave us a good record of the deposits across this bit of the site. This is the west-facing section, which is probably the most easy to understand, and has got the most information in it. So what we found, this is taken down to the natural glacial deposit. So this is actually, so the top of this is to the bottom of the archaeology. What we found is the early sand deposit did continue across underneath the bank here. It looked as if it had been somewhat disturbed, but it appeared to be continuous with what we'd seen to the north in the trench. Cut into that was a feature that I'm not entirely sure what it is, but it looked like the base of a wall. Unfortunately, the section fell a little unkindly here, and you can't see it too well. But when I show you some photographs, you can see that there were actually it was full of very large blocks of stone that ran across the trench. There was a pit cut into this, which had a couple of rather large pieces of slate in it, but we couldn't find out much more about that. The metal surface continued on top of the sand deposit and beneath the bank, but only ran up in both sections as far as the possible wall. So it looks like that respected that. So these features were there before the bank was built. And it looks like the metal surface didn't continue beyond this wall or whatever it is. On top of that was a substantial earth and stone bank. It wasn't just a heap of stones. It was about 50-50 earth and stone. So it appears that it had actually been built deliberately just by dumping earth and stone there. It looks like there was probably a few stones dumped on top of that after it had been built. This produced a terrace at the southern end of the trench, and we could actually see that there was it looked like an area, a deposit of very mixed infill to actually get this to produce a terrace. It looked like material had been dumped in here. It's full of chunks of clay and randomly orientated stones, and on top of that was a very noticeably heat affected layer, which we saw in the photograph of the model, and on top of that we're back to our old familiar, rather featureless post-occupation soil. So let's have a look at some of that as a photograph. So this is one of the big stones that didn't quite make it into the section. There was another one to the other on between this and the other side of the section, and you can see the sand layer and the cobbled layer running through here as well. Not sure why I had another copy of that. So, well, what I'm going to do is have a quick look at the southern end of the site where we encountered the second roundhouse. These deposits sort of run all the way through the whole trench. So that was giving us an idea of the sort of overall sequence within the trench. So this was the roundhouse that we encountered. We got a rather, compared to the other roundhouse, a rather flimsy wall, and it was an infill of fairly large stones, many of them fire cracked. Beneath the stones, we came across several deposits like that. Well, an area of deposits like this, which consists almost entirely of cockle shells. So it appeared to be a midden deposit, and also within there was pieces of bone, including this rather large chunk of a well, quite a substantial dog. The roundhouse was actually constructed as far as we could tell, by digging a hole in this early sand deposit, riveting the hole with a fairly light wall, and then infilling behind it with earth and stones. So this is a section through that. We can see the cut into the sand here, and the facing of the roundhouse, and the infill behind it. So the roundhouse would have had a sunken floor. It's not quite sure, it's not entirely clear how it fits in with the topography. It's possible that this was just cut into a natural slope, and that the lower part was level with the ground, or even terraced out onto the slope. But without further excavation, we can't tell. After we removed the stony deposit, we can see in the section at the far side this midden deposit here, a great concentration of stone, of shells and bone, mostly shells, it must be said. And in the interior of the roundhouse, we can see a nice, well-defined stone-capped drain running around the inside of the wall. And looking at our plan, you can see it. There were a few more features. There was another drain running across the roundhouse there. We've got a post hole, which I'm pretty sure it was a post hole, but it wasn't excavated. There's a stake hole that appeared in the section, and we could see a line of stake holes just inside the roundhouse wall. It also appeared that we got some, as you can see it in the section here, some surviving floor surface here, large amounts of a very solid clay surface, and quite a lot of charcoal and occupation debris there. It wasn't quite so clear as we moved across the site, the roundhouse here, but this was all at the level of the drain. Interestingly, we didn't get any Roman material from below the backfill, so it might be suggested that this was a pre-Roman roundhouse, an Iron Age roundhouse that had been backfilled. Why it was backfilled, we don't know. It could be a ritual feature, or it might be that I would tend to go for the more pragmatic explanation that there was a big hole in the middle of the hill fort that needed filling in, but we can't really tell. Just moving to the other end of the site, we uncovered this large area of burnt, well, heat affected clay, charcoal. It's a sort of vaguely circular, it's not even circular, splodge of this material. We couldn't actually find any. We found one post hole to one side of it, but we couldn't see anything else that suggested a structure there, apart from a line of 3 stones. We had initially suggested from the geophys that the bank was part of a roundhouse wall, but that seems increasingly unlikely. And the sumo geophysics suggests that it perhaps wasn't quite as circular as we originally thought it to be. There's also a large area of rubble in this corner of the trench. It looked like a very deep but loose rubble that appeared to have fallen from some structure between the end of the trench and the rampart. So I think there's probably something else going on quite close to this trench, possibly another structure. And this might actually be an area of domestic activity. I say that because once we look at it in a bit more detail, we found there was an awful lot of pieces of black burnishware sort of apparently trodden into the surface of this. They're heat affected, so there's been fires on top of this after they've been trodden on, probably. And what we found was quite large pieces of vessels actually within this area, all heat affected, and we got lots of pieces of this, of perhaps only 1 or 2 black burnishware vessels. Some of it was heat affected to the point where it's actually changed colour and started to disintegrate. Again, this needs more excavation to be sure what's going on. We may find that with further excavation, we would actually come up with some kind of structure. Another find from this area, just to the side of the burnt area, but at the same sort of level, was this rather badly corroded, but quite nice brooch. It was originally a circular bronze brooch, possibly with a stone or something in the center of it. We can actually see the remains of the pin on one side and the clasp on at the other end. Didn't come up with an awful lot more finds apart from various bits of pottery. There was a tiny piece of Roman glass that came from here as well. Appeared to come from quite a high quality vessel, but it was only very tiny. So this is the plan of that area. So you can see where the burnt material is and our post hole. Yes, clearly we need some further excavation here. Whether that will happen, I don't know. So after 5 weeks, we had to stop and the site was backfilled. It was all covered in teram. So this is a geotextile, so it would be very obvious where we'd excavated to. It would make it very easy to re-excavate the site if required. The current plans are that we will go back and finish excavating the roundhouse later on in this year. As for the rest, I don't know. Negotiations are still going on. One option that may be possible, again, it depends on negotiations with the landowner and various other bodies. It might be possible to actually leave the walls of the roundhouse at least partially exposed on the site after we've finished excavating. This would actually make the site a lot more understandable and would also give us a good idea of the rate of erosion as it slowly falls into the sea over the next decades. So this is the site as it looks now. We'll hopefully be back looking at one of these areas later in the year, but we'll keep you posted on that.